What happened to those lost African American recipes history did not want you to know? These recipes fed families through hardship, marked celebrations, and carried the memory of a community that turned scarcity into tradition. If they held so much resilience and pride, why were they erased? Cabbage and smoked neckbones was one of those dishes that proved poor families could create something soulful and rich out of the humblest ingredients. Cabbage on its own was filling but plain, so African American households often paired it with smoked pork neck bones to stretch both into something hearty enough to serve a crowd. The neck bones, often overlooked by wealthier buyers, were inexpensive yet full of smoky flavor that seeped into the broth as the pot simmered for hours. The cabbage soaked up that depth, transforming into tender leaves that carried the taste of the pork in every bite. Families would eat it with cornbread to mop up the juices, turning what could have been scraps into a full meal that satisfied everyone at the table. This dish became a staple, not just because it was cheap, but because it reflected a philosophy of resourcefulness and respect for ingredients that might otherwise have been thrown away. It was both survival and celebration, reminding families of their own ability to make something meaningful out of very little. Even today, the memory of cabbage and smoked neck bones speaks to the wisdom and strength of kitchens that carried history forward one pot at a time. Field pea succotash carried the taste of farming life and survival, blending together what the land could provide in one hearty dish. African American families often grew field peas, corn, and butter beans, and stewing them together created a colorful, protein-rich staple that could serve as either side or main. The sweetness of the corn balanced the earthiness of the peas, while the butter beans gave creaminess, making the combination filling enough to feed a household on its own. It was often simmered with bits of pork fat or drippings if they were available, but even without meat, it carried flavor and nourishment that kept families going through long days in the fields. Succotash was more than just a dish. It was a link back to African foodways where beans and grains were always central to survival. Families would make large pots of it for gatherings, church picnics, or everyday suppers, proving its flexibility. For many children, succotash was the dish that meant home because it was dependable and comforting. The memory of peas, corn, and beans stewed together was one of both necessity and pride, a reminder of how deeply food connected to survival and community in Black history. Slab bacon gravy with biscuits was a dish that made a little pork go a very long way. In many households, buying a whole slab of bacon meant carefully saving every scrap of fat and drippings because nothing could be wasted. Those drippings, stirred into flour and milk, created a creamy, smoky gravy that could be poured over biscuits for breakfast or even supper when there was little else in the pantry. It stretched the flavor of meat far beyond the amount that was actually eaten, turning something small into a centerpiece meal. The biscuits themselves were made from flour, lard, and baking powder, often simple and rustic, but the gravy transformed them into comfort food that felt abundant even in lean times. For many children, this combination was their first memory of learning what survival tasted like, because it made clear how resourcefulness defined their family's table. Slab bacon gravy with biscuits carried not just nourishment, but dignity, because it turned scraps into something families could gather around and enjoy together. The smoky richness lingered long after the plates were cleared, a reminder that thrift and care could create meals that became history in their own right. Hog jowl with black-eyed peas became one of the most iconic New Year's dishes in African American households, symbolizing wealth, health, and survival all in one pot. Hog jowl was cheap, fatty, and often one of the only cuts of meat accessible to poor families, but when cooked slowly with dried peas, it released its smoky richness into the pot. Black-eyed peas carried their own symbolism, seen as a promise of luck for the coming year, while rice or cornbread often completed the plate. This dish went far beyond taste. It carried hope, resilience, and the memory of ancestors who had relied on similar foods to make it through. It was passed down through generations, tied to both celebration and survival, because starting the year with hog jowl and peas meant starting with abundance even if money was scarce. The tradition blended practicality with spirituality, reminding families that food could carry meaning as powerful as any ceremony. For those who grew up with it, the smell of hog jowl simmering with black-eyed peas still recalls family gatherings and prayers for better days ahead. It was a dish that turned humble ingredients into a ritual of pride and perseverance. Persimmon pudding was a dessert that turned wild fruit into something festive, often appearing during holidays or church gatherings. African-American families in rural areas gathered persimmons when they were ripe. Their sweetness deepened by the first frost and transformed them into a rich pudding baked in iron skillets or casserole dishes. The pulp gave the dessert a unique flavor somewhere between dates and plums, and when combined with flour, eggs, and milk, it created a dense, comforting dish. Molasses or sorghum syrup often replaced sugar when money was tight, giving it even more depth. It was eaten warm, sometimes with a splash of cream if the family had it, but even on its own it felt like a luxury compared to the plain staples of daily life. For children, persimmon pudding often became tied to memories of winter celebrations and the resourceful joy of making something special out of what nature provided for free. It carried a sense of tradition and pride, linking back to older ways of cooking that made use of foraged fruits. Persimmon pudding was a reminder that even in hard times, families found sweetness worth gathering for. Rice fritters, known as callus in New Orleans, were sweet fried cakes that carried the sound of street vendors calling out "Callus bells callus" in the mornings. African American women sold them to earn money, carrying baskets of the warm fritters through neighborhoods as the smell of fried dough and sugar filled the air. Made from leftover rice mixed with eggs, sugar, and flour, then fried in hot fat, callus were proof that nothing went to waste in kitchens where resourcefulness was survival. They were enjoyed for breakfast or as a treat, dusted with powdered sugar or eaten plain right out of the pan. The rice gave them a chewy texture that set them apart from other fried cakes, and their popularity spread far beyond black households as people lined up to buy them. Callus were more than just food. They were livelihood, memory, and history carried in each bite. They connected directly back to West African traditions of rice cookery while adapting to the ingredients available in America. Every crispy golden fritter was a reminder of the women who sold them to support their families, and of the ingenuity that made rice stretch even into dessert. Fried rabbit was a dish born from necessity because hunting often became the only way to put meat on the table when money was scarce. Rabbits were abundant in rural areas, and African American families would skin and clean them before frying in seasoned flour until the meat was crisp on the outside and tender inside. The flavor was mild, often compared to chicken, and the dish quickly became a favorite whenever game was available. It was usually served with potatoes or greens, making it feel like a proper dinner even though it cost nothing but time and skill to hunt. For many children, eating fried rabbit was both a treat and a lesson in how their families survived without relying on expensive store-bought meats. The act of turning wild game into Sunday dinner was part of a larger culture of resilience, teaching generations that food could be found and created outside the market. Fried rabbit symbolized thrift, tradition, and connection to the land, and for those who remember it, the memory is tied to both hardship and the pride of self-sufficiency. Pickled okra was one of the clever ways African American families preserved vegetables so they would last through seasons when fresh produce was scarce. Okra, with its tender pods, was grown in many home gardens and often produced more than families could eat at once. By pickling it in jars with vinegar, garlic, and spices, moms ensured there was something bright and tangy to add to plates months later. Pickled okra was crunchy, flavorful, and worked well alongside heavy dishes like beans, stews, and meats, where its acidity cut through richness. It became a staple at gatherings because it offered a pop of color and zest that livened up otherwise plain meals. Beyond taste, it was a strategy of survival, because preserving food was the only way to guarantee something green in the winter months. The jars lined on pantry shelves told a story of foresight and resilience. Pickled okra stood as proof that African American families made use of everything they grew, turning gardens into sources of year-round nourishment that carried both flavor and memory. Boiled peanuts were a snack tied closely to Southern black farming traditions, sold on roadsides, at gatherings, and in markets where their salty aroma drew crowds. Green peanuts, still soft and fresh from the ground, were boiled for hours in salted water until tender and briny. The result was a snack that was unlike roasted peanuts, softer and more flavorful, eaten straight from the shell. For African American communities, boiling peanuts was a way of enjoying what the land provided without needing fancy preparation or expensive ingredients. They were often sold as a source of extra income, with children and adults alike carrying bags to passers-by. Boiled peanuts carried social and cultural meaning too, because they were tied to summer harvests, family time, and roadside commerce. They were cheap, filling, and distinctly Southern, a reminder of how African American ingenuity shaped even the simplest foods into traditions. Today, they remain a nostalgic snack for many, but their roots in resilience and resourceful farming remain central to their story. Crab stew was a coastal dish that reflected the way African American families used every bit of what the sea could offer. Small crabs, often too little to sell for high prices, were simmered whole in pots of broth with onions, rice, and seasonings. The crabs infused the stew with a deep, briny flavor, while the rice made it hearty enough to feed large families. This dish was common in low-country communities where fishing and crabbing were part of daily survival. Families passed down recipes that varied from house to house, sometimes thickened with okra or flavored with tomatoes, but always built on the same principle of stretching limited seafood into abundance. Crab stew was not only nourishing, it was also communal, often cooked in big pots for gatherings and shared among neighbors. It symbolized the connection between African American communities and the coastal land that sustained them, even when access to more desirable cuts of seafood was denied. For those who remember it, crab stew was a dish of both necessity and pride, filled with flavor that told the story of resilience. Hog cracklings, known as chicharrones in many places, were born from the rule that nothing from the hog should ever go to waste. When pork was butchered, the fat and skin were rendered down, creating small, crispy pieces that carried intense flavor. African American families used cracklings in many ways, sometimes eating them straight as a snack, sometimes folding them into cornbread to give it richness and texture. They were salty, crunchy, and satisfying, delivering both protein and fat in a form that could last beyond the day of slaughter. In communities where resources were scarce, hog cracklings became a prized ingredient because they stretched flavor into foods that might otherwise be plain or bland. For children, they often became a treat, something treasured for its crunch, while for adults, they represented thrift and tradition. Cracklings carried the taste of survival, the knowledge that every part of the animal could be put to use. They linked directly to the hog-killing traditions that brought families and neighbors together, where work and celebration met in one. Even today, many remember the crackle and pop of pork skins in hot fat as a sound of heritage and survival. Rice and gravy suppers might sound simple, but they carried countless African American families through lean years when meat was scarce. A pot of rice could be stretched to feed a large household, and the flavor came from pan drippings turned into gravy after frying meat or even scraps. The browned bits left in the skillet were deglazed with water or broth, seasoned with salt and pepper, and thickened with flour to create something rich enough to pour over bowls of rice. It was not just about taste, it was about making sure nothing was wasted, because even a few spoonfuls of drippings could transform plain rice into something comforting. This dish was eaten everywhere, from weekday suppers to late-night meals after long days in the fields, proving its dependability. For many children, it became a memory tied to hunger being eased because the warmth of rice and gravy meant there was at least enough to fill their bellies. Parents leaned on it because it cost almost nothing, but it carried dignity by turning scraps into a complete meal. Rice and gravy suppers told the story of thrift, resilience, and the comfort found in making do with what you had. Cane syrup glazed sweet potatoes turned a humble root into something festive and sweet. Families baked sliced or halved potatoes in cast iron skillets, coating them with thick cane syrup as they roasted. The syrup caramelized, creating a sticky glaze that made the dish feel indulgent, almost like dessert, though it was often served as a side. Cane syrup was cheaper than refined sugar and easier to find in rural communities, while sweet potatoes were abundant in gardens or markets, making the pairing both thrifty and dependable. Families prepared the dish for Sunday dinners, holidays, and community gatherings because it felt special without requiring much cost. Children remembered the smell of syrup filling the house, while adults saw it as proof that creativity could turn ordinary roots into a dish worth celebrating. Cane syrup glazed sweet potatoes stand today as a reminder of thrift, resilience, and joy, crafted from simple, affordable ingredients. Pine bark stew was a community dish tied to African American coastal traditions in North Carolina. Despite its name, there was no bark involved, but instead, fish, potatoes, onions, and tomatoes stewed together in huge pots that fed entire gatherings. Families often prepared it outdoors at church events or celebrations, with the smell of simmering fish mingling with smoke from open fires. The stew was hearty, spicy, and communal, designed to be ladled generously into bowls and shared freely. Often made with smaller fish that had little market value, it proved that resourcefulness could turn simple ingredients into abundance. Cornbread usually accompanied it, soaking up the broth and completing the meal. For many, pine bark stew became more than food. It was a memory of neighbors, laughter, and togetherness. It showed how resilience could transform necessity into celebration, weaving community and survival into every steaming bowl of stew. Wild mustard greens with hot sauce were a thrifty dish that made use of what the land freely offered. Families foraged the bitter greens from fields and backyards, gathering bunches to clean and simmer until tender. They were often seasoned with pork fat or onions when available, but what made the dish memorable was the finishing touch of homemade pepper sauce or vinegar. This simple addition balanced the bitterness and added flavor, turning wild greens into something nourishing and satisfying. For families with little access to fresh produce, the greens became a vital source of vitamins that helped keep diets balanced in hard times. They represented both thrift and resourcefulness, since they cost nothing beyond time and labor. The ritual of gathering and seasoning them became tied to family memory and community identity. Wild mustard greens with hot sauce carried pride, showing how even weeds could become a dish worth remembering. Mulatto rice was a low-country dish that blended African food traditions with the resources of the American South. It combined rice with beans or peas, simmered with seasonings, and often a bit of pork for flavor, turning basic staples into something sustaining and rich. The name reflected its mixture, much like the cultures and histories that shaped it. For African American families, it was both practical and flavorful, because rice stretched far and beans supplied much-needed protein when meat was limited. Generations carried it forward, with roots in West African rice-growing knowledge brought across the ocean. Families cooked it in large pots to feed many, whether at daily suppers or larger gatherings, reinforcing its role as both survival food and comfort dish. Each plate represented endurance and adaptation, carrying the strength of heritage. Mulatto rice stood as proof that African American cooks turned necessity into tradition, making meals that carried resilience and pride. Stewed goat was a dish that echoed the Caribbean roots of many African American communities, carried forward by migration and memory. Goat meat was lean, flavorful, and often cheaper than beef or pork, making it a practical choice for households on tight budgets. When simmered slowly with peppers, onions, garlic, and spices, the meat became tender and rich, filling pots with a savory aroma that promised comfort. The dish varied across families, some adding tomatoes or potatoes, others flavoring it with hot peppers for extra kick, but the essence remained the same: resourcefulness meeting tradition. Goat connected communities to African and Caribbean foodways where the animal had long been central to celebrations and everyday meals alike. For African American families, cooking goat became a way of holding on to heritage while also making do with what was available in American markets. It was often served with rice or cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, ensuring nothing was wasted. Stewed goat symbolized survival, culture, and the continuity of traditions that might otherwise have been lost. For those who remember it, the taste remains tied to family, identity, and the strength of memory in African American kitchens. Molasses cookies were a sweet born of necessity, created when sugar was either too costly or scarce for struggling households. Molasses was cheaper, widely available, and full of flavor, so it replaced refined sugar as the key sweetener in many baked goods. Mixed with flour, spices like ginger or cinnamon, and a bit of lard or butter, molasses cookies baked into crisp, dark rounds that smelled of warmth and comfort. They were sturdy enough to last for days or be packed into lunch pails, making them practical as well as enjoyable. For children, these cookies were often the only regular treat they could expect, and the taste of molasses became tied to memories of home and comfort. Parents, meanwhile, saw them as proof of thrift and ingenuity, showing that even scarcity could make space for joy. Families often kept baking them even when times improved because they had become beloved traditions. Molasses cookies were more than dessert. They were a survival sweetened by resourcefulness. Hog trotters, or pig feet stew, were one of the most frugal yet memorable dishes found in African American kitchens, proof that no part of the hog ever went to waste. The feet, mostly bone and cartilage, were simmered for hours until the collagen broke down into a thick, gelatin-rich broth. Onions, garlic, and peppers gave it flavor, transforming humble scraps into a meal that was hearty and sustaining. Served with rice or cornbread, the stew became filling and comforting, even though it used cuts many others discarded. For families with little money, hog trotters carried both necessity and pride, showing the ability to transform what others overlooked into something meaningful. The gelatinous texture was prized by many, and though sometimes challenging for children, the taste left strong memories. It was often prepared in big pots for gatherings, where food and stories were shared freely. Hog trotters reflected resilience and heritage rooted in African traditions where every part of the animal was valued. Carolina pea rice was a low-country dish that tied directly to African rice-growing traditions carried across the ocean by enslaved people. Families simmered cowpeas with rice, often adding lard, ham hocks, or smoked pork bones to build flavor. The rice gave bulk, the peas supplied protein, and the pork scraps brought depth, turning simple ingredients into something filling and satisfying. It was more than just a meal. It was a continuation of African foodways that shaped entire landscapes while feeding generations creatively. In poor households, pea rice was an efficient way to stretch resources, ensuring that everyone at the table could eat well. It was both ordinary and special, appearing in daily suppers but also at larger community gatherings. For children, it was the taste of home, reliable and comforting. For adults, it was heritage, survival, and pride served on a plate. Carolina pea rice remains a dish of resilience and culture. Turnip green pot pie was a dish that turned a pile of bitter greens into a main course by layering them beneath a golden cornbread crust. African American families who grew turnips in their gardens made use of every part of the plant, and the greens were simmered until tender, seasoned with pork scraps or drippings, and then tucked into cast-iron skillets before being topped with cornbread batter. Baking it all together transformed what could have been a side dish into a hearty, filling supper that stretched vegetables into something worthy of being the star of the table. Families valued it because it was affordable, nutritious, and practical, feeding everyone without requiring much meat at all. Children often loved the buttery crust most, while adults appreciated the thrift that brought it together. It was both clever and comforting, a reminder that resourcefulness could create meals that carried warmth, flavor, and pride. Fish head soup was one of those dishes that proved African American cooks could turn what others discarded into something nourishing and delicious. Fishmongers often tossed the heads aside, but frugal families took them home and simmered them with okra, onions, and tomatoes until a rich broth emerged. The heads released flavor into the pot, making the soup taste of the sea even though it cost almost nothing. The okra thickened the broth and added substance, turning the dish into something that could feed many bowls with little expense. Families served it with rice or cornbread, making the meal filling enough to count as supper. While some might have looked down on eating fish heads, those who grew up on the dish remembered it as both comfort and ingenuity. Fish head soup was a reminder that survival depended on seeing value where others saw waste and turning scraps into sustenance. Batter-fried eggplant was a Depression-era dish that reflected the need to make vegetables taste like meat when meat was too expensive to buy. African-American families sliced eggplants, dipped them in seasoned flour or cornmeal batter, and fried them in hot fat until golden brown. The result was crisp on the outside, tender on the inside, and hearty enough to mimic the texture of fried cutlets. This trick allowed families to bring variety to their tables while still feeding everyone on a small budget. For children, the crunchy coating made it feel like a treat, while adults knew it was a clever way to make something from the garden feel indulgent. It became popular because it was simple, affordable, and adaptable, with different households seasoning it in their own ways. Batter-fried eggplant stood as proof that frugality could also bring satisfaction, turning vegetables into meals worth remembering. Rice pudding with raisins was a dish that carried comfort into African-American kitchens, stretching leftover rice into a sweet dessert or breakfast. Families simmered rice with milk and sugar until it thickened, then folded in raisins and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg when they had them. The raisins added bursts of sweetness that made the dish feel more special, while the spices created warmth and aroma that filled the home. It was a recipe that made use of inexpensive staples but felt indulgent, offering families a chance to enjoy something sweet even during lean years. Rice pudding was versatile, eaten warm or cold, and could last several days if made in a large batch. For many children, it was one of the few desserts they regularly enjoyed, leaving strong nostalgic ties. Rice pudding with raisins symbolized care and ingenuity, proving that comfort could be made from the simplest of foods. Fried corn, sometimes called cream-style skillet corn, was a dish that celebrated summer harvests while also providing everyday sustenance. Families shaved kernels fresh off the cob, scraped the milky pulp, and fried them in skillets with butter or bacon drippings until they became creamy, sweet, and savory all at once. The result was a dish that could serve as a side with greens, beans, or meats, or even stand alone when food was scarce. It was flavorful and filling, showing how fresh produce could be transformed with little more than a skillet and patience. For children, fried corn was a taste of summer, while adults valued it as a reliable way to feed a family without relying heavily on meat. It became a tradition in many households, tied to gatherings and harvest time. Fried corn was a testament to resourcefulness and the beauty of making the most of what the land offered. She crab soup was a low-country delicacy tied to African-American coastal cooks who perfected the art of making the most out of the sea's gifts. The dish combined crab roe with cream, onions, and seasonings, simmered slowly into a rich and velvety soup. It was often associated with South Carolina, where African-American culinary traditions shaped some of the most iconic dishes of the region. Though considered luxurious by outsiders, it was born from the need to use every part of the crab, including the roe that might otherwise be wasted. Families served it as a special dish for gatherings or holidays, bringing a sense of pride and celebration to the table. For children, it felt like a treat because of its creamy richness, while adults remembered it as a link to coastal heritage. She crab soup symbolized survival, ingenuity, and the artistry of turning overlooked ingredients into unforgettable meals. Wild berry cobblers were one of the sweetest ways African-American families turned foraged food into dessert. Blackberries, dewberries, or wild strawberries were gathered from fields and woods, often by children with pails in hand. Once washed, the berries were sweetened and baked beneath or atop simple dough, biscuit, or cornmeal crusts. The result was bubbling, fragrant, and deeply comforting, bringing joy to tables that otherwise saw little in the way of sweets. It cost almost nothing but effort, yet it produced something that felt luxurious and celebratory. For many families, berry picking was a seasonal ritual tied to both necessity and fun, making the cobbler as much about memory as taste. Served warm, often with a splash of cream if available, it became a centerpiece dessert. Wild berry cobblers reflected the heritage of resourcefulness and community, turning the gifts of the land into something sweet enough to feed both body and spirit. Pork neck bone soup was one of the heartiest ways African-American families stretched scraps of meat into a filling meal. Neck bones, often cheap and overlooked at butcher shops, were simmered slowly with beans, rice, or vegetables until the broth became rich and flavorful. The meat fell from the bones, tender and satisfying, while the broth thickened into something hearty enough to count as supper. It was a dish that made the most of humble cuts, proving that even bones could be transformed into abundance with time and care. Families often paired it with cornbread, ensuring that nothing went to waste as every drop of broth was sopped up. For many children, the taste of neckbone soup was tied to home and warmth, while for adults it was a reminder of thrift and survival. This soup carried dignity, showing how resilience created nourishment from what others threw away. Chicken bog was a Carolina staple that blended rice, chicken, and sausage into a dish that was both practical and deeply comforting. African-American families in the region embraced it as an affordable way to feed large gatherings because one pot could stretch to feed many mouths. The chicken provided flavor and substance, while the rice absorbed the broth and created bulk. Sausage added spice and richness, making the dish feel abundant even when portions of meat were modest. It was often prepared for church events, family reunions, or community suppers, where its heartiness made it a favorite. For children, it was a dish they grew up on, dependable and warming, while adults valued it for its thrift and adaptability. Chicken bog represented both tradition and ingenuity, carrying flavors that linked back to African rice dishes while also adapting to Southern resources. It remains a dish tied to pride and memory. Fried green tomatoes were one of the cleverest ways African-American families made use of unripe fruit before it spoiled. Green tomatoes were sliced, dipped in cornmeal or flour batter, and fried in hot fat until crisp on the outside and tangy inside. The tartness of the tomato balanced with the crunch of the coating, creating a snack or side dish that was both cheap and delicious. For families with gardens, it meant that nothing went to waste, because even tomatoes that had not ripened could be turned into food. It became a seasonal favorite, eaten in the summer months when gardens were overflowing. For children, it was a treat with unique flavor, while for adults, it was a lesson in thrift. Fried green tomatoes were simple but powerful in their message. That waste was not an option, and creativity could transform even the most unlikely ingredients into comfort. Share the recipe you would bring back in the comments, like if this history moved you, and subscribe to keep these lost flavors alive.